Joining us today are a trio of folks from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and FEMA. The primary speaker starting us off today is Mia Van Horn. Mia is a water regulations and zoning specialist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the Floodplain program. She has been with the department for the past 5.5 years. Mia currently coordinates floodplain zoning ordinance and outreach communications work for the floodplain management program. She assists Wisconsin communities in joining the National Flood Insurance Program. She also helps with ordinance interpretation, technical assistance, and education. Mia holds a master's degree in ecology from the University of Missouri, Columbia, and a Bachelor of Science degree in wildlife and natural resource management from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. Also joining us for the second part of the program will be Sarah Rofeco, who is the State Floodplain Management Program Coordinator for DNR, as well as Gabriel Jackson, who is the Floodplain Management Specialist for FEMA. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. As you joined today, everyone was muted, but we will be asking you to join us for a few poll questions throughout, as well as if you have questions, I will be moderating Q&A at the end. So feel free to find the chat button. Typically that's located on the bottom of the screen. It looks like a little discussion button. You may need to hit the more button to find it on your particular screen. You could go ahead and advance the next slide. Sarah, I think you're able to advance the slides. Oh, we don't have that one here. So why don't I actually just go ahead and hand that over to Sarah then, and we can get started with the presentation, actually to Mia.
Thank you, Becky. I'm going to turn off my video so we don't have any interruptions. But thank you all for coming today, and welcome to our second of a three-part series of our floodplain zoning, of this floodplain zoning webinar. And today I will be starting off the presentation talking about how does a community update a floodplain zoning ordinance and why does that need to get done? And then Sarah will finish off discussing, once you have an ordinance, how do you administer that ordinance? So starting off, why does a community need to update? What are the reasons? And I have 4 listed here. They're not in any particular order of frequency. They all come up pretty fairly equally, but nonetheless had to make a list. So number 1 is FEMA has issued a letter of final determination, or an LFD. That's basically a fancy way of saying that the firm maps have been updated by FEMA. And what happens then is FEMA sends a letter to the community letting them know that those firms have been updated, and the community has a 6-month window to get those firms and the FIS adopted. The main thrust behind that is for communities that participate in the NFIP. If that ordinance is not adopted within that 6-month time frame, then the community is suspended from the NFIP, and the citizens that hold policies, those policies are no longer effective. So there's a real, and there's other consequences, but that's one of the main ones. Another reason to update the community floodplain zoning ordinance is that the state has an updated model and the community language may be out of date. So the latest state update was 2022. And some communities, like if you look at your ordinance and you notice that the last DNR approved letter that you have for your ordinance is older than 2022, it would be a good time to consider, do we need to update? Another reason for updating is that the community has a mixed code where the floodplain ordinance is not standalone. And what we mean by that is that the floodplain zoning ordinance is not its own contained like subchapter or chapter within the code, meaning from beginning to end, in how to do variances, how to do what the penalties are for violations, and the definitions. All of those we recommend be in one standalone place for floodplain zoning. The reason being that, and this sometimes is not understood by many communities, the reason being that if the community maintains a mixed code, then any time a part of that code is changed, Whether or not it has to do with floodplain zoning, a DNR floodplain zoning ordinance approval letter is still needed so that the community maintains compliance with their floodplain zoning program. So that's why we advocate for that. And if you can, what we often talk to communities about with this is it's a time and expense sink for the community to obtain a DNR approval every time they update their code. So that's why we try to mention that just to help as a time and cost savings for the community to keep that ordinance separate. And then the fourth reason is that there's updated regulatory data that needs to get inserted into the ordinance. Something like there's a new CLOMAR issued, or there's a LOMAR issued, or a new flood study, or a dam failure analysis. So State Code NR 116 requires that new data be adopted within 6 months into the ordinance, and federal code requires the adoption of the CLOMARs. Next slide, please. So why does an NFIP participating community need to update? So in our state, there's approximately 620 communities, and of those, about 560 belong to the National Flood Insurance Program. And timely adoptions keep the community in good standing with the NFIP. Without a DNR approved ordinance, the community is at risk of being suspended from the NFIP by FEMA. A suspension does result in the loss of federal funding for structures in the special flood hazard area, so it can affect the sales of homes or structures that are in that special flood hazard area. And then there's that flood insurance component where it's no longer available for purchase, and those that currently have a policy would not be able to receive a payout if they had a claim, if the community was in suspended status. So these are reasons why participating communities need to update. Next slide, please. So what are the adoption types? There's basically two. One is a repeal and recreate. So that's essentially when the language in the current ordinance is out of date. And we usually recommend, if the ordinance is older than 2012, that it does a full repeal and recreate, although based on the current update in 2022, I would say even 2017, we would recommend a full repeal and recreate, just because there's language kind of scattered throughout that would need to be changed, and it's time savings to just do the repeal and recreate rather than pick through it line by line to find where those changes are. The other way of doing an adoption is through an amendment, and when we do, most of our amendments are when there's a few sections, mostly in the official maps, like when there is a new LOMAR or a new CLOMAR or a new dam failure analysis that need to be inserted into that ordinance. Usually those are when we do amendments. Next slide, please. So just as an example of the CLOMAR or the LOMAR, these are the example that you see on your right is what it looks like when it is issued from FEMA, and it will tell you the effective date. And so state code requires that those that new data be adopted within 6 months, and FEMA wants to see all the CLOMARs adopted as soon as they are issued. So what I pointed out here on the slide is for CLOMARs in particular, the local zoning official can issue a permit after the CLOMAR is adopted into the ordinance. So we need to get those adopted as quickly as possible. But we have a 6-month window for the LOMARs as well as those dam failure analyses. Okay, next slide, please. And here's the dam failure analyses. So just a little background on these. State statute does define large dams. So those dams that are defined as large are required to have a dam failure analysis. And what that DFA does is it defines the area downstream that would be flooded if the dam were to fail. State Code NR 116 requires that developed areas downstream of the dam, of these large dams, be zoned and regulated as floodplain. So what happens is once that DFA has been reviewed by DNR and approved, then our regional water management engineer sends a letter to the local community zoning administrator indicating that that DFA has been reviewed, approved, and that begins that 6-month window to get that DFA adopted. Next slide, please. So once we have a reason to adopt, how do we do that? So I'm going to go through now the steps of how to do an adoption, what the DNR does to assist, and what some common pitfalls are that would hold up the adoption. So starting at the first step is getting that ordinance update crafted. So the DNR does have a template that can be used, and we do encourage communities to use it because that model meets the state and federal minimums. So communities can deviate from the model language, but what they can do to deviate is to add in higher standards that make that ordinance more restrictive. They cannot change the language to make the ordinance less restrictive than those state and federal minimums. And so sometimes when we're working with a community DNR, we will offer to do the update for the community, do the draft for you so that the community can then review it internally. We, as staff here in the floodplain program, we do this a lot, so we can set up a draft fairly quickly with just with a little dialogue with you and getting answers to a few questions that we would insert into that template. We do this as a service, and just so you kind of understand the background, FEMA provides grants to all 50 states. And one of the things that our state does with that money is we provide the service to the communities then to help speed up and kind of assist the communities in getting that draft set up. Because sometimes our smaller villages or smaller cities, they don't have dedicated floodplain zoning staff, and these updates are not done that frequently. And so this is a service we provide. On the other hand, some communities prefer to develop that ordinance on their own. And what we do then is if the community submits an ordinance independently and DNR has not crafted it for the community, then if we review it and we see that there's areas where the language deviates, we will send back a checklist that identifies those areas, and then we would use that checklist to go back and forth and discuss what changes need to be made, if any. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the state model, what it looks like the first page. It is color coded. So what we do, these different color codes help identify sections where there is aquatic agriculture language or flood storage language, coastal language, community, the CRS language. All of these sections, sometimes the community doesn't have coastal zones, for example, so that language can all come out. If a community, for example, does have coastal language and DNR drafts the ordinance for the community, we would leave that section highlighted in pink, as you see here in the example, so that the community can see it, look at it, know where that language is and what it says, because oftentimes the coastal language is new. So we try to make it as simple as possible. Next slide, please. This is an example of that community checklist that we would use. We use this mostly when the community has higher standards. So it helps us go back and forth and identify what specific sections we need to discuss. Sometimes we need to, if the community has already added their own language or their own numbering, the community app populates this column, the local section column, with their numbering system, and then we use this to go back and forth. It's quite helpful to help us find the section that we need to discuss. And then we do, if a community submits an ordinance independently and hasn't had DNR craft it for them, then sometimes if there's a lot of differences between the model and the community draft, we will send this back to the community and ask them to fill it out to identify those places. Next slide, please. So next step in the adoption process after we have a draft is to obtain a response from DNR floodplain staff indicating that that ordinance is approvable as written. And we highly recommend this because if a community goes ahead and adopts without a DNR review and without receiving that email from DNR, then there's a chance that on the approval end, after all the noticing and the adoption and all that staff time for the community has been committed, there's a chance that that ordinance might not be approvable because maybe there's some language in there or a date was missed or something like that. So we try to avoid that as much as possible. And that's why we ask communities to have DNR review it before noticing, before it goes through like the community internal committee review or the public hearing. Next slide, please. Next step is to notice that public meeting. This is a statute requirement. The DNR does have templates that we can send to the community if they want them. That just gives examples of what other communities have used for that noticing language, and then what it looks like to have the final official proof of that notice. The main things to keep in mind about the public hearing noticing that are required in statute are that the notice must be for 2 consecutive weeks, and that last week must be a minimum of 7 days before the public meeting. It's okay to have that last week be more than 7 days before the public meeting, but it just can't be less. So that's something I want to emphasize because I see communities struggling to exactly make the 7 days, and it doesn't have to be exactly 7 days. It just can't be less than 7 days. Next slide, please. And then another thing I want to point out is if your community has designated an official newspaper, meaning let's say you're a small village and you designate the county paper as the official paper for the village, and that's been an official act by the community, then that must be the paper used for the noticing for the adoption process. Because sometimes the community will want to use a newsletter, and that's not an official paper. And sometimes the community might usually use a certain paper, but if it's not designated as an official paper, then you don't have to use that newspaper to publish your notice. Then the community has an option to post instead. Or you could do a mixture of posting and publishing. It's up to the community. But it's usually our counties, most of our counties and our larger cities that have a designated official paper. And actually some of our villages do as well. But I wanted to point that out that if there's not a designated official paper, it does give a little more flexibility to the community to choose to publish or post those required notices. Next slide, please. So this is an example of the documentation that DNR needs for that public meeting. This is the official affidavit of the notice of the public meeting. So on the left-hand side is the example that we would get from the newspaper that shows that there were 2 insertions of that publication, and then the actual physical example of what was published. So what DNR staff do is we check the date of the public hearing and we check the dates of the insertions to make sure that the statutory requirements were met. That's for communities that publish. On the right, you'll see the example for communities that can post. And this affidavit is created often by the clerk, but it really can be created by any official in that community. And it needs to state the same things. It needs to prove that it was posted for 2 weeks. And then we also require with this an example of what was posted. And then because it's a posting, we need to meet the other statutory requirements, which are where was it posted. So for posting, it needs to be either in 3 physical locations, public physical locations, or the website, the community website, and 1 physical location. So those things are required in the affidavit. Next slide, please. So next steps in the adoption process are to go ahead and hold that public meeting after the noticing has been completed, and then the local governing body adopts the ordinance. Next slide. Then step 6 is the last notice. There's 2 noticing then. We've talked about the public hearing, but this one is the notice of the enacted ordinance, which is what is done to say to the community, heads up, this ordinance has been officially adopted and enacted by your community. And again, DNR has templates that the community can use to see what other communities have posted or published for that notice. You can use that language if it's helpful. We offer that if you need it. Then the notice, this is the example of the notice of the enacted ordinance of the official affidavit. So the left is for communities that publish and the right is for communities that post. Next slide. So step 7 is then the community requests the ordinance approval from the DNR by submitting those required documents. So the required documents that we need are a certified statement and copy of the ordinance amendment. So I'll show you what this looks like next, but the certified statement is essentially a statement from an official in the community that says this is the true and correct copy of what we adopted. And then they email a copy of what was adopted. And then the other 2 things are what we've been talking about, the affidavit of the Class 1 notice of the enacted ordinance and the affidavit of the Class 2 notice of the public meeting. Next slide, please. And this is what that looks like, the certified statement. If the community wants an example, this is usually what I send, this one here. And then the copy of what was actually adopted. So next slide. Then the DNR issues the approval. So we send that then back to your community, and then we work with FEMA to secure their approval for the community. Next slide. So common ordinance adoption errors. One of the big ones is this Class 2 notice. This is required in statute. This is why we have no wiggle room to change this. If there is inadequate notice of the public meeting. It must be for 2 consecutive weeks, with the last week being a minimum of 7 days before the public hearing. So it can be more than 7 days. It just can't be less. Next slide. Another common ordinance adoption error is that the community does not seek DNR or FEMA approval for the adopted ordinance. So I mentioned earlier that approximately 560 of the 620 communities in our state belong to the NFIP. If the community is a member and they do not have a DNR approved ordinance, then they put themselves at risk of being suspended. Coming in the future, there will be more frequent checks of the communities in terms of audits, reviewing whether or not those ordinances are current. So in the past, there hasn't been as frequent of checking with the communities on their floodplain program, but this will happen more frequently starting in 2025. So, just as a heads up that it would be wise to check your ordinance, make sure that if you just adopted, you would be surprised how frequently we will have communities say to us, well, we just adopted, but we have no approval on record. We didn't see it. And so this is why this is a good reason to go back and check and make sure you have that DNR approval for your current adopted ordinance. Next slide. I think. Yep. And then we have this ordinance adoption guide that is available. It's on our website. We can email it to you as well. The state DNR floodplain email inbox is right there at the bottom of this slide, dnrfloodplain@wisconsin.gov. Maybe if someone could drop that into the chat. That can be used to get this document if you want it. Otherwise, I do believe that this slide or this presentation will be posted and available to all of you if you have questions or follow-up, if you want to review it again. But we will have time for questions after Sarah does her portion of the talk today. I think that's my last slide. Yep.
Yep, it is. Thank you so much, Mia.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so now that we have an approved ordinance, now what do we do? So essentially what I'm going to go through is I'm going to go through the ordinance in order and just provide some examples of how you administer these sections. And I mean, your ordinance really should be a roadmap to how you handle permitting and development within your community. So my thing is I always go back to the code, but you are going to have cases where it's going to be complex, it's going to cross different zones, you know, and that's kind of what we're here for, is when those complicated scenarios come up, you know, you have another set of eyes on it who can help you navigate those more complicated issues. So I guess the first question, and this one goes to the chat, is what is the purpose of reviewing applications in the floodplain? So if everybody can kind of answer, throw an answer in the chat, and then I'll move on to the next slide and kind of go over that purpose. Protect property, yep. Determine compliance. Yep, those are great. Statement of purpose, protect life, health, and property. Minimize expenditures of public funds for flood control projects. You don't need flood control projects if you aren't developing in the floodplain, or if you are developing to the standards in the ordinance, in the floodplain ordinance. Minimize rescue and relief efforts. Minimize business interruptions. Minimize damage to public facilities. Minimize the occurrence of future flood blight areas. Discourage the victimization of unwary land and home buyers. And this is kind of a big one. One of the things that I spent a lot of time on was answering questions about prospective buyers. So the better that you understand your ordinance, the better you can help them determine whether they really want to pursue this purchase on this property or not. Prevent increases to flood heights, and discourage development in a floodplain if there is any other alternative. So starting off in section 2 of the model ordinance, the community shall review all permit applications to determine whether proposed building sites will be reasonably safe from flooding, and assure that all necessary permits have been received from those governmental agencies whose approval is required by federal or state law. So that is a minimum NFIP standard. There must be permits for any kind of floodplain development. So I have some examples here. Some communities decide to take on and they do a specific floodplain permit, you know, which is a little more detailed, but you can also do this last option where you just essentially have something here that says floodplain, yes or no. And then within your permitting system, it would be identified as floodplain. And the purpose of that is, as we get out and we do audits in communities, one of the things that we request is we want to see all of the floodplain permits that have been issued. So making sure that you have a way to get all of those floodplain permits in the easiest way through your permitting system, that really takes off some of the workload, as opposed to going through paper files or rifling through all of your permits. So section 3 goes into the floodway district. So there are certain things that are allowable and not allowable in the floodway. And it also has to, you have permitted uses. So open space uses are allowed in the floodway district and the floodway areas if they are not prohibited by any other ordinance. They meet the standards in sections 3.3 and 3.4. All permits and certificates have been issued according to section 7.1. And these are the permitted uses through that, and all of the ordinances should be laid out with these permitted uses. key thing with the floodway is that the floodway with the modeling is a very sensitive area. So any encroachment could potentially cause a rise. So you should be in the practice of requiring something called an H&H analysis. So it says here, applicants shall provide an analysis calculating the effects of this proposal on the regional flood height to determine the effects of the proposal. So get in the habit, if you are in a defined area with a floodway or a detailed analysis area, make sure that you are checking or requiring that the applicants provide that analysis. So this one comes up quite a bit, questions about riprap installation in a floodway. So one of the questions I have here that comes up a lot is, does this need a local permit?
So there should have been a poll that popped up on your screen to answer this one. And just,
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of answers come in, and
I'll reveal the results here real soon. It looks like we're getting most people answering the same way, which is saying yes.
okay, yes.
The results
So
there.
there is an exemption with the DNR or riprap if it's less than 300 linear feet. So sometimes applicants will go through and they will apply, or they will go to the DNR first to get a permit for that. They'll find out that they're exempt, and then they will just proceed with the project because it didn't require a DNR permit. So one thing we need to make sure that, both DNR as an agency and the community is communicating to the applicant is that, okay, you might not need a DNR permit for this, but you do need a local permit because this is still impacting your floodplain. So one of the conditions of development in the floodway is that you can't put structural fill in a floodway unless it is protected by riprap. But at the same time, with that statement right there implies that riprap is allowed in the floodway. But we do need to make sure that whatever riprap is being installed there is not creating a rise. So that would fall to the local community to make sure that you're doing that. So you will need plans for this project. You will also need to verify that there's not a rise, and a local permit is definitely necessary because this is development in the floodplain. So the next is flood fringe district, and this is all new development. I'll get to the pre-existing and the non-conforming structures in a little bit. So standards for development in the flood fringe, residential, if you pull up this in the model ordinance, it extends right after residential. There's accessory, there's commercial, there's manufacturing and industrial. So pretty much anything is allowed here. And because of the way the modeling is done, you don't have to worry about fill creating a rise here, because the way that these areas are mapped, flood fringe is not mapped and modeled as providing any kind of storage. So we don't have to worry about creating a rise here. People can add 10 feet of fill in an area if they wanted to. So state minimums for structures, well, this is residential structure in flood fringe. It has to be with the lowest floor 2 feet above base flood elevation. The fill has to be 1 foot above base flood elevation, and it has to extend 15 feet out. We do have a lot of communities that grant variances for that 15 feet of fill requirement. Sometimes you have smaller lots where that's just not possible. And we do understand that. So, but yeah. Okay, next is the general floodplain district. And this is essentially going to be your zone A's, your zone AOs, your zone AHs, and AE zones without a floodway. So this will generally be AE zones without a floodway are generally lakes. AO zones, usually on a map, they give you a flooding depth as opposed to a base flood elevation. So how you determine that is you go off of the natural grade and you go to whatever that depth is. A lot of times AO zones, if they're right next to an AE zone where there's an elevation. So those AO zones generally have higher requirements. So when you have those multiple zones, make sure you're always using the more restrictive, the one that requires somebody to build higher. Also with A zones, the next slide. So this is a depiction of in a zone A, and the difference between a zone A and a zone AE with a floodway is that we don't know where the floodway is here. So in this example, what do we need to know before we can approve a residential permit here?
So I launched the poll question, and this is a two-part question. So the first part, you can add a response, a short text response if you'd like, what we need to know. And then Sarah also has a second question that she can pop up if you'd like on this one. What if the H&H shows this is a floodway? So this is a single choice here. Construction can continue so long as it meets the elevation. Construction can continue with further analysis. Permit should be denied, or both A and B. I'll give you guys a few minutes to respond, and then I'll show the results. So it looks like responses are slowing, so I will end the poll and share the results. And I'll let Sarah discuss these.
I am not seeing the poll
You're not
answers
seeing
for
them?
the short
Okay.
answer. Nope, I'm not seeing the short answer, but
Okay. Oops.
that's neither here
Oh.
nor there. So what we need to know about this site before we can continue or approve anything here is we need to know where the floodway and the flood fringe are. So it's kind of hard to see from this visual, but this particular site is right here. And then you can see this kind of curve here. This is a smaller creek, essentially. So you can see how close it gets to that potential build site. So this will need an H&H before approving the build. H&H would provide that delineation of the floodway and the flood fringe, and it would also provide the base flood elevation. So with this one, in case this did come back and show this as floodway, you know, the question with this is, if it shows it as floodway, so this is a residential permit, and one of the conditions of permitting things in the floodway is that you can't put anything in the floodway that is made for human habitation. So you would not be able to approve this, even if you could show that it did not meet the, if it did not cause a rise. So the correct answer for this one is that the permit should be denied. Come back. There we go. So non-conforming uses. This is probably where you're going to spend the bulk of your time if you have to administer a floodplain ordinance. So I highlighted specific sections of the code. So as the permit applications are received, municipalities shall develop a list of those non-conforming buildings, their present equalized assessed value, and a list of the costs of those activities associated with changes to those buildings. No modifications or additions to a non-conforming use or structure shall be permitted unless they comply with this ordinance. So modification and addition include but are not limited to any alteration, addition, modification, structural repair, rebuilding, or replacement of any such existing use. So this is also where it kind of outlines maintenance. I have a little more on that too, because we do have standards that require that you cannot exceed 50% of the equalized assessed value over the life of the structure. So all of your improvements are added up over time, and each one of those improvements constitutes a percentage. And when all of those percentages over time add up to 50%, then that house would be required to then meet the minimum standards for a new construction in that flood fringe area. So, and this is the definition of maintenance. It just helps to kind of give you a little better idea of what you can exclude from that 50% tracking. So the act or process of ordinary upkeep and repairs, including redecorating, refinishing, non-structural repairs, or the replacement of existing fixtures, systems, or equipment with equivalent fixtures, systems, or structures. So like furnace replacement, water heater, we even allow for roof and for siding. But understand that even if they're all addressing maintenance, if all of that maintenance comes through and it's more than 50% of the cost or the value of that structure, then it becomes an NFIP issue because FEMA does not exempt any kind of maintenance things. So what you should essentially be doing in your community is looking at both. So you have a permit come in, you first check and see that it's under the FEMA's 50%, which is per occurrence. So, and that's usually on like a rolling 12-month. But if you have all the permits come in for an improvement or a maintenance project or a lot of maintenance projects at one time, so long as it's less than the 50%, it can be approved for FEMA. For the state, you're looking at the cumulative, but you can exempt any of the maintenance activities. But maintenance activities done as part of an improvement project should be considered improvement. So equalized assessed value, generally you're going to be working pretty closely with your assessor's office because you're going to have a lot of questions. You're going to have to check the current assessed value. And generally what I've seen on assessor's office websites is that they will put the total improved value or total improvements value. They won't give you a breakdown if there's multiple structures. So I had to go back and forth with the assessor quite a bit just to make sure that I was using the value of that structure. Okay. So the equalized assessed value, that's also something you can ask for from your assessor, or your assessor can provide you with that ratio. So with the example in the last slide, it was 148,000. So we would take that and divide by this 0.9899. And that would give you an equalized assessed value of that house at 149,510. So, and you can request this from your assessor's office generally. So now I'm just going to go through some examples of substantial improvements and substantial damage because both of those apply when it comes to those cumulative tracking. So in this example, we have a cumulative substantial damage tracking. So in 2008, there was a flood, it was damaged 20%. 2011, it was damaged 8%. And in 2017, it was 22%. Now, the goal of our program is to have these numbers, these dollar amounts go down each time something is flooded. So this totals up to 50%, and the rule is 50%. So once it hits 50%, that building must be brought into compliance with the floodplain ordinance. So essentially, when you're approving permits, they would essentially need to be under 50% for you to be able to approve that. So in this example, we have a cumulative substantial improvement tracking, and this is what you're going to encounter more than anything. I spent a lot of time doing tracking on these projects, but I also had a lot of structures in the floodplain. So you might not have that many, so it may not be that tremendous of a workload for you, but I say that definitely was for me when I had to do it. So in this case, we have a 20% improvement for an addition, an 8% improvement for a bathroom remodel, and then we have a 22% improvement for a main floor renovation. So that gives us a 50% cumulative improvement. So can you approve the renovation? And if you did, I'm going to say, no, you can't approve it. If you did approve it, what would it violate? Would it violate FEMA? Would it violate the state? Both or neither? Ooh, we're definitely getting some variances here between answers. This is really interesting. So in this case, remember, NFIP is 50% per project. So we have 20% in 2008, 8% in 2011, and 22% in 2023. So by FEMA standards, none of these projects would violate FEMA. This would only be a violation of the state if you approved it, because it would be at or above the 50% rule. So this is only the state. You're always going to hit that state standard for the 50% rule before you hit FEMA's. Oh, I think I got one more. Okay. So here's another example. This one includes both improvements and damages. So in 2008, they had 20% damage. In 2011, they had 8% improvement. In 2015, is 3%. In 2018, it's 2%. So all of these totaled up. Can you approve it? And would this violate the NFIP? All right, so I will say that this is actually a trick question, because in 2015, they did a furnace replacement. A furnace replacement is considered maintenance. Looking at this and just looking at these percentages, we can see that this does not violate the NFIP minimum standards, because none of these are related to the same project and none of these are over 50%. But if we take out this 3%, now we have 28%, 30%, 48%. So yes, you could approve this renovation. So now that we've had some examples on that, Section 7 of the model ordinance is administration. This right here is essentially, if you're the lucky soul that gets to administer your floodplain ordinance, this is essentially your job description. So advise applicants of the ordinance provisions, assist in preparing permit applications and appeals, and assure that regional flood elevation for the proposed development is shown on all permit applications. Now, a lot of times you will also be requested to provide that base flood elevation. Surveyors will call for it, engineers will call for it. So make sure that you are familiar and comfortable with being able to determine what your base flood elevation is, and being able to read the maps and using the flood insurance study and all of those pieces. If you do need assistance with that or some training, please let me know. I could do something in an office hours just on reading maps if you would like. But that's a very big component of your job, is being able to identify those base flood elevations. So keep records of all official actions. The name of the game in floodplain management is documentation. And you basically keep your documentation in perpetuity. You never get rid of it. So elevation certificates, floodproofing certificates, your plans, all of that stuff should be kept in perpetuity. And it's very useful when it comes to elevation certificates, because you can look at those in the future. So if the property changes hands and you have an owner that is in the floodplain and they just bought the property and they're trying to get flood insurance, having those elevation certificates on file is really handy. It's also really handy to have if you have a neighboring property that wants to get a letter of map amendment. You can use that data if they're at similar elevations, like, well, your next door neighbor was able to get a letter of map amendment, so you might be able to get one too. So it's very handy to have those elevation certificates and stuff on file. So Section 8 of the model ordinance that essentially pertains to letters of map change. So with the letters of map change, Mia talked about it a little bit too, about making sure that you are adopting those. That would not apply to letters of map amendment or LOMR Fs, but for the big ones, the ones that change like multiple lots or affect multiple lots, those do have to be adopted. So the standards for that are, right here, make sure there's no obstructions or increases unless they are applying for a conditional letter of map revision, which would also require them to make legal arrangements by any owners that are affected by that. I also, one of the big parts of that is it kind of refers back to the beginning of the ordinance. And this is in 1.55, where it talks about removal of lands from the floodplain. So FEMA standard says that it just has to be at base flood elevation, the lowest adjacent grade around the structure, or the lot elevation has to be at BFE, but the state standard for removal is that it has to be 2 feet above the base flood elevation, and that it also must be contiguous to land outside the floodplain. So we have quite a few of these come in. We get a report like every month that talks about these, that gives us a listing of all of the LOMR Fs that have been approved in the state and who signed them. So letters of map change. So when I talk about who signed them, I'm talking about a community acknowledgement form. And there are certain types of letters of map change that do require the community to sign off on it. And that would be a LOMR F, a CLOMR F, and then a letter of map revision, a conditional letter of map revision, and a physical map revision. So all of those different types of things, because if you're administering a floodplain ordinance, you will undoubtedly come across somebody who wants to get out of the floodplain. And this is how you do that. So that community acknowledgement form is documentation that states a project has complied with local floodplain management ordinances and is reasonably safe from flooding. Now this is italicized because that actually means something. There's something, FEMA has something called the Technical Bulletin 10-01, and that breaks down reasonably safe from flooding. So when it comes to signing a community acknowledgement form, first you look at the ordinance. Has that area been filled to BFE +2? Is it contiguous to land outside the floodplain? And then on the community acknowledgement form, there are other standards that need to be met because you are signing that it is complying with local and state ordinance. You are also signing that it meets the endangered species analysis. So if it's conditional, then the applicant has to show the endangered species analysis with their conditional letter of map revision application. But if they are doing a LOMR F, meaning that they filled the site already and that they're applying for the LOMR F, they skipped the conditional process, then you have to get that endangered species analysis before they fill. So it's very important when people come in and they're doing a land disturbance permit, adding fill, doing all of those things, that you're making sure that you're finding out what the goals of that project are. If the goals of that project is to remove that land from the floodplain, they need to do this before they fill. Reasonably safe from flooding, that's Technical Bulletin 10-01. And what that basically implies is that the area that they filled has been compacted to a point that it would be structurally sound to build on. So it wouldn't, and the other part of compaction is making it doesn't allow water intrusion that would impact any kind of foundation or anything. So those are generally the things that you would want to make sure that you are requiring as part before you're signing that community acknowledgement form. And the last section of the ordinance is related to enforcement and penalties. So when you begin to enforce your floodplain ordinance, you are undoubtedly going to have things that crop up as violations. So I get a lot of questions about enforcement. I'm finding out that some counties don't have citation authority. So I'm working with other counties and trying to get those questions answered on what would be the best path forward for these ZAs that don't have citation authority and have to rely on the sheriff's office. So, but just a basic enforcement process, first off, you have the violation that's identified. So you send the owner a written notification with a compliance date. Usually they will reach back out to you. So your follow-up comes on the compliance date. You check to see if the violation has been remediated. If not, you try to make contact with the owner. If you can't make contact with them, you need to send a written notification. Generally, I would give a little more time and a compliance date, and I would also state in that particular letter, like, hey, citations are coming if you don't comply by this date, or at least reach out to me for an extension. So citations would continue until compliance is met. And then the last stage of that is litigation begins. You would work with your village, city, county legal department and basically provide all of your evidence. So you would provide the proof of the violation, any notification letters that were sent, any follow-up attempts that you made, all of the citations, all of those things for the attorney to be able to build a case. Judge will make a ruling. And if the judge rules in favor of the owner, sometimes that happens, I would suggest that you notify the states, so me probably, and FEMA of the violation and of all of the enforcement actions that you've taken. So when it comes to violations, it can impact your community's participation in the NFIP. So make sure that you have good documentation of all of these steps, because FEMA can use something called Section 1316 which would then keep that violation from impacting the community's participation. So. And that's all I got. So I guess we'll open it up to any questions.
All right, well, thank you so much, Sarah and Mia. It was an excellent presentation once again. I want to remind everyone, you're welcome to type any questions in the chat box. I also did include a link to our floodplain contacts by county for DNR. And Sarah, maybe as a closing thought, if you would like to review, or Mia, if you'd like to review, when is it best for folks to contact those county DNR contacts versus reaching out directly to either of you? Are there certain issues that they should fast track, or is the county contact always the best?
I would always start with the county contact because, you know, Mia and I, like, we oversee things from the state level. So, you know, having everybody from the state contacting us first, like, that would be really overwhelming. But, you know, obviously use your best discretion on determining that. But usually the regional water management engineer would be your best point of contact because they would be able to refer to the best person to answer questions.
Perfect. And we did have one more question coming from David, so I'll read that one to you here. It says, you discussed seeking DNR and FEMA approval of floodplain ordinance. The DNR process is clear. How does a municipality apply for FEMA approval?
I can take that one. What happens is once at the time that DNR issues the approval to the community, like literally once we press send the email to the community, we at the same time send a separate email coordinating with Gabe, who's on the call here, to coordinate the approval for the community. So the state does that for you. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Gabe.
Nope. You did a perfect job of explaining it. It might take me a day or two, but or maybe a little longer, but I will get it approved. And yeah, it's just processed normally on our side, and then the state will let you know that it's approved. So nothing that the community has to do directly with FEMA. But you may get a, so say you're going to adopt your maps in a couple of months, you may be getting a, just a quick email, a reminder from myself or, you know, somebody else from FEMA basically stating that you have to, you know, complete the requirements of the update. If you're already working with the state, you know, sometimes that can be a little jarring and you're like, oh my gosh, I thought I've already done everything. You might actually have everything completed, but those are automated letters. So if we don't have everything completed on our end and approved, you'll get that automated letter. So don't worry too much, and always just reach back out to the state or myself if you have any questions about your ordinance adoption.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And just a reminder for everyone to join us next week when we will be hearing from Gabe directly about coastal floodplain management, and Sarah and Mia will also be joining for those. If you would like to visit the webinar resources page, we've posted the materials from last week. We have copies of the presentation, the video and audio files separately, and you can expect within a day or two of this webinar that we will get this week's materials posted as well. So thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.